There are stories that do not rush toward you. They wait. They linger at the edge of awareness, like a memory that does not belong to one lifetime, but many. Tonight, you are not being asked to learn anything, only to remember, to let the present loosen its grip, and allow older rhythms to return, gently and without effort. Somewhere beneath language, beneath names and dates, there is a quiet intelligence that has always been watching, a keeper of measures, a witness to cycles. This story begins where writing itself once began to listen. Before gods ruled temples and before kings carved their victories into stone, there was already an understanding that reality followed patterns. The ancients did not experience the universe as random or mechanical. They felt it breathing, counting, remembering itself through time. In the earliest Egyptian memory, long before dynasties had names, wisdom was not owned. It flowed, and it required a guardian. That guardian would later be called Thoth, but the name came much later, after the role had already existed for ages beyond counting. If you feel drawn to these long currents of memory, you may quietly subscribe, not as an obligation, but as a way of returning again and again to the same calm shore where these ancient stories continue to speak. Thoth does not arrive in Egyptian tradition as a conquering god or a creator born from violence. He appears already formed, already watching, already measuring. He is present at beginnings, but never claims them as his own. Instead, he records them. In this way, Thoth is not simply a god of wisdom. He is the condition that allows wisdom to exist at all. Without record, without balance, without memory, creation would dissolve back into noise. Thoth stands precisely at that threshold, where chaos learns to hold its shape. In the earliest myths, Thoth is described as self-created, not because he formed himself from nothing, but because his nature does not depend on lineage. Other gods emerge through genealogies, rivalries, and acts of separation. Thoth exists through function. He is needed, therefore he is. This makes him unique among the gods of Egypt. He is not fueled by worship, fear, or sacrifice. He is sustained by accuracy, by truth spoken correctly, by numbers aligned with the sky. His symbols tell this story quietly. The ibis, with its curved beak, mirrors the crescent moon. The baboon, seated in contemplation at dawn, greets the rising sun not with dominance, but with attention. Thoth belongs to liminal hours, dawn and dusk, the pause between breath and word. He governs the moon not as a romantic object, but as a regulator of time, tides, fertility, and decay. The moon remembers what the sun forgets. Thoth listens to that memory. As Egypt's cosmology deepened, Thoth's presence became indispensable. When gods argued, he mediated. When order fractured, he recalculated. When souls died, he stood beside the scales, not judging but ensuring the measurement was fair. Even the gods, it was said, could not alter a verdict once Thoth had recorded it. Ink, once set, became destiny, not because it was cruel, but because it was accurate. This is why later generations would whisper that Thoth did not invent writing. Writing emerged because Thoth was already there. Language crystallized around him. Mathematics bent itself into symbols. Astronomy aligned into calendars. Civilization, in this view, was not humanity rising upward, but memory settling downward into form. And Thoth was the one who remembered first. As this story unfolds, Thoth will not behave like a distant myth. He will move through time, changing names, wearing new faces, crossing cultures without ever leaving his post. The keeper of wisdom does not age. He accumulates. And once his presence is noticed, it becomes difficult to look at history the same way again. Once noticed, his presence begins to appear everywhere, like a pattern that had always been there, but required the right angle of attention to emerge. The ancient Egyptians did not describe Thoth as living in one place, because place itself was something he helped define. He was associated with Hermopolis, the city of 8, but even that was symbolic rather than territorial. Hermopolis was not his home. It was a reflection, a location where the principles he governed became visible enough to be honored with stone. In the cosmology that predates temples, the universe begins not with light, but with a state of indeterminate potential. The Ogdoad, 8 primordial forces arranged in pairs, represent this condition: darkness and invisibility, motion and stillness, moisture and absence. These were not gods in the human sense. They were tendencies, conditions. Before anything could exist in form, it had to exist as balance. And it is here, within this quiet equilibrium, that Thoth's role becomes unmistakable. He is not counted among the Ogdoad, yet without him their coexistence could not endure. He is the intelligence that allows opposites to remain paired without collapsing into dominance. This is why later texts describe him as the tongue of the Creator, the mind of the Sun God, the one who speaks the world into coherence. Speech, in this sense, is not sound. It is precision. To name something correctly is to stabilize it. To misname it is to invite decay. This is why truth in Egyptian thought was not subjective. It was structural. Ma'at, the principle of cosmic order, is often described as justice or harmony, but those translations are incomplete. Ma'at is alignment between what is spoken, what is done, and what is real. Thoth does not create Ma'at. He maintains it. He ensures that actions remain consistent with consequences across time. Without him, Ma'at would fracture into intention without memory. The myths describe moments when even the sun god falters, when Ra grows old, when his eye wanders, when creation threatens to unravel through exhaustion rather than violence. In these moments, it is Thoth who intervenes, not with force, but with correction. He restores sight. He recalculates cycles. He replaces raw power with measured continuity. In doing so, he reveals a deeper truth. The universe does not survive through strength alone. It survives through coherence. Thoth's relationship with time is subtle. He does not rule it as a tyrant. He segments it: days, months, seasons, years. He inserts intercalary days where none existed before, allowing divine births to occur outside fate's original design. This act alone reshapes destiny. By adjusting the calendar, he alters what is possible. Time, under Thoth's supervision, becomes flexible without becoming chaotic, structured without becoming rigid. This flexibility is what allows knowledge to persist through catastrophe. Floods erase cities, dynasties collapse, languages shift, but measurements endure, ratios remain. The sky still moves, according to patterns that can be rediscovered if one knows how to look. Thoth is the one who ensures that the instructions are never completely lost. They may be buried, fragmented, mythologized, but never destroyed. As centuries pass, Thoth's image grows more complex. He is no longer only a mediator among gods, but a teacher of humans. Scribes invoke him before writing a single line. Physicians credit him with healing formulas. Astronomers rely on his calculations to align stone with star. Knowledge becomes sacred not because it is secret, but because it is precise. And precision, once lost, is difficult to recover. This is the quiet power of Thoth. He does not demand belief. He rewards attention. Those who observe carefully, who record honestly, who respect proportion and rhythm, find themselves aligned with something ancient and resilient. Those who distort, exaggerate, or forget invite imbalance, not as punishment, but as consequence. And so the God of wisdom continues to watch, not from above, but from within the systems themselves, waiting for the next moment when memory must be restored, and time must once again be taught how to hold together. What makes Thoth increasingly difficult to classify is that his wisdom is never static. It evolves, not by changing its nature, but by adapting its expression to the needs of the moment. As Egyptian civilization matures, his presence begins to move from cosmic maintenance into cultural inheritance. He becomes less of a background force and more of a guide, quietly shaping how humans understand their place within the larger order he preserves. This transition is subtle. There is no myth where Thoth descends dramatically to instruct humanity. Instead, knowledge seeps outward. Writing appears not as a sudden invention, but as a remembered skill. The earliest hieroglyphs do not describe Thoth as their creator in a technical sense. They imply something more intimate. Writing is described as his breath made visible. Words are not tools. They are extensions of a living intelligence that prefers clarity over power. Scribes, therefore, are not craftsmen alone. They are intermediaries. To write is to participate briefly in Thoth's function. This is why scribal schools treated accuracy as a moral act. A poorly copied text was not merely an error, it was a disturbance. Each line carried weight beyond its immediate meaning. Each symbol had to sit correctly within the larger rhythm of the page, just as the moon must sit correctly within the cycle of the sky. As this idea takes root, Thoth's role expands into medicine, law, and ritual. Healing spells attributed to him are not framed as miracles, but as restorations of balance. Illness is seen as misalignment. The cure is recalibration. Legal judgments invoke his name not to intimidate, but to remind all parties that truth has consequences that extend beyond personal desire. Under Thoth's gaze, even intention leaves a measurable trace. There are stories where Thoth competes with other gods, but these contests are never about dominance. They are about correctness. When chaos attempts to masquerade as order, Thoth exposes the flaw. When illusion threatens to replace substance, he identifies the missing measure. In this way, wisdom becomes an active force. It does not merely observe, it intervenes through discernment. One of the most revealing aspects of Thoth's character is his relationship with secrecy. Contrary to later interpretations, he is not a hoarder of hidden knowledge. He does not withhold truth to maintain superiority. Instead, knowledge is layered. Some things require preparation to understand, not because they are forbidden, but because premature clarity can be destructive. A calendar in the hands of someone who cannot count days accurately becomes a weapon against harvest. A spell misunderstood becomes poison. This layered transmission gives rise to temples not just as places of worship, but as centers of preservation. Archives, libraries, star charts, medical papyri, all fall under Thoth's domain. Time itself becomes an archive, with events stored as lessons rather than isolated incidents. To forget is not a failure of memory alone. It is a failure of stewardship. As centuries accumulate, Thoth's influence begins to stretch beyond Egypt's borders, not through conquest, but through resonance. Travelers encounter ideas that feel strangely familiar. Numbers behave the same way under foreign skies. The moon follows identical laws across distant lands. The principles Thoth maintains do not belong to a single culture. They belong to structure itself. This universality plants the seed for transformation. Thoth will not remain only Egyptian. His function is too essential to be confined by one name. As languages shift and civilizations rise, the keeper of measures prepares quietly to be recognized again under different symbols, carrying the same memory forward into new forms, waiting for those who still know how to listen. Waiting to be recognized again does not mean disappearing. It means allowing time to do what it always does best, reshape surfaces while preserving deeper structures. As Egypt's influence reaches outward, carried by trade routes, migrating scholars, and shared skies, the qualities associated with Thoth begin to surface in unfamiliar places, not as replicas, but as echoes. The same intelligence, refracted through different cultural lenses, answering the same human need for continuity amid change. In these new contexts, wisdom is still linked to language, measurement, and the movement of the heavens. Writing remains sacred. Numbers remain charged with meaning beyond utility. The act of recording is still understood as an intervention against forgetting. This continuity suggests something important. Thoth was never bound to a specific geography. Egypt simply became the place where his function was first articulated clearly enough to endure. As the Bronze Age world becomes increasingly interconnected, myths begin to travel faster than monuments. Stories cross borders more easily than stone. In these stories, the figure of the divine scribe adapts. Sometimes he is a messenger, sometimes a guide for souls, sometimes a trickster who uses intellect rather than strength to restore balance. The form changes, but the pattern remains stable. Wisdom continues to appear as something that moves between worlds, translating rather than ruling. This movement introduces ambiguity. As Thoth's attributes spread, they begin to overlap with those of other deities. Lines blur, functions merge. This is not confusion, it is convergence. When different cultures independently associate wisdom with language, astronomy, and mediation, they are not copying. They are recognizing the same underlying structure through different experiences. Thoth becomes less of a character and more of a principle that can be embodied in many ways. Within Egypt itself, this period brings increased complexity. The gods become more human in their stories, more emotional, more conflicted, yet Thoth remains remarkably consistent. He does not gain dramatic flaws or rivalries. He continues to operate as a stabilizing presence, stepping in when narratives threaten to spiral into excess. Even when deception is required, it is used to correct imbalance, not to exploit it. There are myths where Thoth uses cunning to outwit forces of chaos, but these acts are always precise. Deception is not celebrated. It is tolerated as a corrective tool when direct truth would fail. This nuance matters. It reveals a worldview where morality is not rigid but contextual, guided by outcome rather than purity. What matters is restoration. What matters is whether the system continues to function. This approach to wisdom contrasts sharply with later traditions that frame knowledge as power to be wielded. Under Thoth's influence, knowledge is responsibility. To know something is to become accountable for its application. Ignorance is not condemned, but misuse is. This distinction shapes Egyptian attitudes toward learning for centuries, creating a culture where education is slow, disciplined, and deeply ritualized. As time moves forward, pressures mount. Foreign powers encroach, dynasties weaken, the certainty of permanence begins to erode. In these moments of instability, Thoth's role becomes even more critical. He is invoked not to prevent change, but to guide it, to ensure that what must end does so cleanly, and that what must continue is recorded carefully enough to be found again. Because civilizations fall, libraries burn, temples collapse, but patterns survive if they are encoded well. Thoth's true legacy is not any single text or symbol. It is the method by which meaning is preserved across collapse, a way of thinking that assumes loss is inevitable, but total erasure is not. And as the ancient world edges closer to transformation, the keeper of measures prepares for his most profound shift yet, a change not of function, but of identity, one that will carry his wisdom into entirely new philosophical landscapes, where gods become ideas and memory learns to survive without myth. That shift arrives not as rupture, but as translation. When cultures evolve, the deepest ideas rarely vanish. They change vocabulary. They trade temples for texts, rituals for reasoning, myth for metaphor. Thoth moves through this transition almost seamlessly, because he was never dependent on imagery alone. His essence was always abstract enough to survive reinterpretation. As Egypt's political power wanes and Hellenistic thought spreads across the Mediterranean, The old gods begin to speak in new philosophical accents. In this environment, Thoth encounters a culture already fascinated with logos, with reasoned speech, with the invisible structures behind the visible world. The Greeks do not simply adopt him, they recognize him. They see in his functions something familiar, something already implicit in their own emerging systems of thought. The divine mediator, the guide of souls, the inventor of letters, the patron of calculation. These qualities converge naturally with a figure they already know by another name. This convergence does not erase Thoth, it reframes him. The myths soften, the animal forms recede. What remains is function, communication between realms, the regulation of time, the transmission of knowledge between the divine and the human. In this new philosophical climate, wisdom becomes less about maintaining cosmic balance through ritual and more about understanding the principles that govern existence. Thoth adapts easily to this shift because his authority was never based on spectacle. It was based on structure. What changes most dramatically is how memory is preserved. Where Egypt relied on continuity of tradition, Greece emphasizes inquiry. Questioning becomes a form of reverence. To investigate the nature of reality is not an act of defiance, but participation. Thoth's ancient role as recorder transforms into something quieter, but no less powerful. He becomes associated with the act of knowing itself, not the accumulation of facts, but the alignment of mind with pattern. This transformation carries risk. When gods become ideas, they can be misunderstood as abstractions detached from consequence. Knowledge can drift away from responsibility. The precision Thoth once guarded through ritual discipline now depends on individual integrity. The measure is no longer enforced by divine decree, but by intellectual honesty. Wisdom becomes fragile in a new way. It can be distorted not by chaos, but by ego. And yet, something remarkable happens. Even stripped of temples and priesthoods, the core principles endure. Mathematics still reflects the sky. Language still shapes reality. Time is still segmented, tracked, and corrected. Calendars still require adjustment. Truth still demands accuracy. These are not cultural accidents, they are inheritances. Thoth's legacy does not disappear when his name changes. It embeds itself deeper into systems that continue to function even when belief fades. As this legacy moves forward, it begins to attract those who sense that beneath philosophy lies something older. Thinkers who suspect that reason itself has a genealogy. That logic did not emerge spontaneously, but was inherited from a much earlier conversation between humanity and the cosmos. For these individuals, wisdom is not invented, it is recovered. This realization sets the stage for a new synthesis, one that blends myth and philosophy, ritual and reason, memory and speculation. In this synthesis, Thoth will appear again, not as a god worshipped openly, but as a figure whispered about in coded texts and layered symbols, a name that suggests not just knowledge, but knowledge of knowledge. And through this name, the ancient scribe will step once more into the center of human thought, carrying the same quiet question he has always asked. Are you measuring carefully enough? That question echoes most clearly in the figure that emerges during the late Hellenistic and early Roman periods, when myth, philosophy, and mysticism converge into something deliberately layered. Here, wisdom is no longer addressed to the many, but to the prepared. Texts begin to speak in riddles. Meaning folds inward. The reader is no longer a passive recipient, but a participant whose understanding determines what is revealed. It is in this atmosphere that the ancient intelligence once known through ibis and moonlight takes on a new voice, one that speaks in dialogue rather than decree. This voice becomes associated with Hermes Trismegistus, a figure described not as a god in the traditional sense, but as a thrice great teacher. The name itself is a synthesis. Greek messenger and Egyptian scribe merged into a single authority that transcends cultural boundaries. What matters here is not the biography of the figure, but the function he serves. He is presented as the source of sacred knowledge, transmitted through conversation, reflection, and disciplined insight. The texts attributed to him do not demand worship. They invite alignment. They describe a universe structured through correspondences, where the movement of stars reflects the movement of mind, and where understanding is an act of remembering rather than discovery. This is not innovation, it is continuity. The same principles once guarded by temple scribes are now encoded in philosophical language, preserved in treatises meant to survive outside ritual frameworks. What distinguishes this phase of Thoth's legacy is its inward turn. Wisdom is no longer primarily about maintaining external order, but about restoring internal coherence. The cosmos is mirrored within the human being. To know the structure of reality is to recognize it within oneself. This idea carries immense power and equal danger. It suggests that ignorance is not imposed from outside, but chosen through distraction. That clarity is available, but not automatic. The Hermetic writings emphasize discipline of perception. Not all eyes see the same world, because not all minds are tuned the same way. Reality remains consistent, but access to it varies. This echoes the ancient Egyptian insistence on preparation, but shifts responsibility entirely onto the seeker. There are no priests to mediate, no rituals to enforce correctness, only attention, patience, and humility. This shift ensures survival. As empires rise and fall, texts can be hidden, translated, misattributed, rediscovered. The knowledge persists because it no longer depends on institutional continuity. It becomes portable, fragile, yes, but adaptable. Thoth's role as guardian of memory evolves once again, now protecting wisdom by embedding it within systems of thought that can pass unnoticed through hostile eras. Yet something is lost in this transformation. Without shared ritual, wisdom risks isolation. It becomes the province of small circles, easily misunderstood, easily distorted. Symbols detach from their original grounding. Metaphor replaces measure. The balance between mystery and precision grows harder to maintain. The ancient scribes' quiet supervision becomes more necessary than ever, and still the current flows. Through alchemy, through astrology, through early science, the same insistence on correspondence, proportion, and record-keeping persists. The name may fade, the imagery may change, but the function remains intact. Somewhere beneath theology and theory, the old question continues to resonate, patient and unyielding, waiting for the next moment when humanity once again needs to be reminded how to measure what truly matters. That reminder becomes especially urgent as knowledge begins to accelerate. When wisdom moves faster than the structures meant to contain it, imbalance follows. The later ancient world feels this tension acutely. Techniques once reserved for careful preservation are now pursued for transformation. Alchemy seeks not just understanding, but power over matter. Astrology moves from observation into prediction. Language, once a stabilizing force, becomes a tool for persuasion and control. Thoth's legacy enters a dangerous phase, one where precision can be bent toward ambition. Yet even here, the deeper current does not vanish. Within alchemical symbolism, beneath layers of metaphor and secrecy, the same principles remain visible to those trained to see them. Measurement still matters. Proportion still governs transformation. The idea that matter and consciousness reflect one another is not a poetic invention. It is a structural assumption inherited directly from the oldest cosmologies. Change is possible, but only within constraints. Transmutation requires understanding, not force. This period reveals a paradox at the heart of wisdom. The more powerful knowledge becomes, the more essential restraint grows. Without it, insight collapses into manipulation. The ancient Egyptians understood this instinctively. Their rituals slowed knowledge down. They embedded learning within repetition, ceremony, and ethical framing. As those containers dissolve, the responsibility once shared by institutions now rests entirely on individuals. It is no coincidence that during times of rapid intellectual expansion, figures associated with hidden wisdom become controversial. They are accused of secrecy, elitism, or deception. But this misunderstands the original function. Layered knowledge was never about exclusion. It was about protection. Some truths act like fire, useful, illuminating, but destructive when handled without care. Thoth's insistence on preparation was not arbitrary, it was preventative. As centuries turn and the ancient world gives way to new religious frameworks, the old gods are formally dismissed. Temples close, names are forbidden or forgotten, but functions are harder to erase than images. The role of the scribe reappears as the scholar. The record keeper becomes the historian. The measurer becomes the scientist. Each inherits fragments of a much older responsibility, often without realizing it. What changes most is humanity's relationship with time. Linear narratives replace cyclical ones. Progress becomes the dominant story. Memory is no longer something to be preserved carefully, but something to be overcome. The past is framed as primitive rather than foundational. In this environment, Thoth's voice grows quieter, not because it is absent, but because it contradicts the prevailing momentum. And yet, even within linear systems, corrections are required. Calendars drift, calculations fail, assumptions collapse. Each time reality resists prediction, the ancient lesson reasserts itself. Precision matters. Observation must be renewed. Records must be revised honestly. These moments are echoes of Thoth's enduring presence, reminders that no system remains aligned indefinitely without attention. The God of wisdom was never meant to be worshipped eternally. He was meant to be practiced. His disappearance from overt myth does not signal defeat. It signals diffusion. His influence spreads into disciplines, methods, and habits of thought that persist precisely because they no longer require belief. And so the story moves forward into an age that believes itself entirely new, yet continues to rely on measures, symbols, and systems whose origins stretch back beyond recorded memory. Whether acknowledged or not, the ancient scribe still stands nearby, watching how carefully humanity chooses to count, to name, and to remember. Watching how humanity chooses to remember becomes more complex as memory itself changes form. Stone yields to parchment, parchment yields to print, print yields to abstraction. With each transition, knowledge becomes easier to distribute and harder to anchor. What was once learned slowly through apprenticeship and repetition can now be acquired rapidly, often without context. This acceleration alters the relationship between wisdom and time, introducing a gap that the ancients would have found dangerous. In earlier ages, knowledge matured alongside the knower. To understand a calendar required living through seasons. To read the sky required years of observation. Error corrected itself through lived consequence. In the newer world, information can be detached from experience. Symbols travel faster than understanding. This is not inherently destructive, but it increases the likelihood of misalignment. Thoth's ancient role as regulator becomes harder to fulfill when measurement is separated from meaning. Yet this separation also reveals something unexpected. Even stripped of myth and ritual, the human mind continues to seek pattern. Faced with overwhelming data, it instinctively searches for coherence. It builds models, theories, systems. These are modern expressions of an ancient impulse. The desire to align thought with reality has not diminished. It has merely changed its tools. Where priests once guarded star charts, algorithms now track motion. Where scribes once corrected scrolls, machines now flag inconsistency. This continuity raises an unsettling question. If the function remains but the awareness of its origin fades, does wisdom become weaker or simply quieter? The ancients believed that forgetting the source of order invited imbalance, not because the source demanded recognition, but because amnesia breeds carelessness. When systems are treated as self-originating, their fragility is underestimated. Maintenance becomes optional. Correction is delayed. Throughout history, moments of crisis often coincide with moments of rediscovery. When prevailing models fail, older perspectives regain relevance. Cycles reassert themselves within linear narratives. Feedback loops expose hidden assumptions. In these moments, echoes of Thoth's principles resurface, not as nostalgia, but as necessity. Measurement is refined. Language is clarified. Records are re-examined. This pattern suggests that wisdom does not disappear. It retreats, waiting for conditions where it can be recognized again. Thoth was never a god of permanence. He was a god of recalibration. His presence becomes most visible when imbalance reaches a threshold where correction is unavoidable. Collapse and insight often arrive together. As this realization settles, the story prepares to widen its lens. The figure of Thoth, once rooted in Egyptian cosmology and later diffused through philosophy and method, now stands as a question rather than a character. What does it mean to inherit wisdom without remembering its lineage? Can precision survive without reverence? Can knowledge endure without patience? These questions do not demand immediate answers. They unfold slowly, across generations. And as the narrative continues, the ancient scribe's legacy will be traced not only through texts and symbols, but through humanity's repeated struggle to balance speed with understanding, progress with memory, and power with care. That struggle marks the threshold between myth and reflection, where the story of Thoth begins to turn inward, asking not only who he was, but why his presence keeps re-emerging at critical moments in human development. At this stage, it becomes less useful to think of him as a single divine figure, and more revealing to understand him as a recurring solution to the same existential problem. How does a thinking species preserve coherence across time? Every civilization that reaches a certain level of complexity encounters this problem. Information multiplies. Decisions ripple outward with unintended consequences. Memory fragments. Without a stabilizing principle, complexity collapses under its own weight. In the ancient world, Thoth served as that principle, embodied as a god to make the invisible visible. But the role itself is older than any pantheon. It is the function that emerges whenever intelligence confronts duration. This is why the earliest depictions of Thoth emphasize not creativity, but regulation. He does not invent the world. He prevents it from unraveling. In modern terms, he is closer to a system administrator than an architect. He monitors thresholds. He logs events. He ensures that errors are corrected before they propagate beyond repair. This perspective reframes wisdom itself. Wisdom is not brilliance, it is continuity. When viewed this way, the myths take on new depth. The weighing of the heart is not merely a moral judgment. It is an audit, a comparison between internal state and external truth. The scribe standing beside the scales does not punish. He verifies. The outcome is not based on intention alone, but on measurable alignment. This is an unsettling idea because it suggests that reality responds not to belief, but to accuracy. Accuracy, however, is exhausting. It requires constant attention. This is why civilizations periodically abandon it in favor of simpler narratives. Absolutes replace nuance. Dogma replaces measurement. In these periods, wisdom is often accused of being cold, detached, or inhuman. Thoth, as a symbol, fades because his demands are too quiet and too persistent. He does not offer comfort. He offers correction. And yet, correction is precisely what allows systems to survive long enough to offer comfort later. The ancient Egyptians understood this tension. Their rituals were not designed to inspire ecstasy. They were designed to maintain alignment. Repetition was not boredom, it was reinforcement. By reenacting cosmic order daily, they trained attention to notice deviation before it became catastrophe. As the narrative moves deeper into interpretation, the question shifts again. If Thoth represents a universal function, then his reappearance across cultures is not coincidence. It is inevitability. Wherever time is tracked, wherever language is formalized, wherever truth is recorded with the intention of surviving the present moment, his signature is present. This leads to a more unsettling possibility. Perhaps Thoth was never external at all. Perhaps he was the earliest attempt to personify a cognitive necessity, a way for ancient minds to relate to the discipline required to think accurately over long spans of time. In this view, the God of wisdom is not a being who teaches humans, but a mirror reflecting what humans must become to endure. If that is true, then the disappearance of Thoth from overt worship does not mark the end of his influence. It marks a test. Can humanity maintain precision without myth to enforce it? Can memory survive when it is no longer sacred? The next phase of this story will explore how ancient thinkers wrestled with these questions, and how traces of the old scribe may still be shaping thought in ways rarely acknowledged. Those traces become clearer when we examine how ancient knowledge was structured rather than what it claimed. Long before formal science, there existed methods of observation that prioritized repeatability, correction, and restraint. These methods were embedded in ritual not to obscure them, but to protect them from misuse. Thoth's wisdom was never mystical in the sense of being irrational. It was mystical because it recognized limits. It acknowledged that not everything should be acted upon immediately, even when understood. This restraint is what distinguishes wisdom from intelligence. Intelligence accumulates. Wisdom curates. The ancient scribe did not seek to know everything at once. He sought to know enough to maintain balance. This ethic shaped how information was stored. Knowledge was segmented. Astronomical data was separated from ritual instruction. Medical formulas were copied alongside ethical warnings. Nothing existed in isolation. Context was part of the content. When later generations encounter these texts without their original frameworks, confusion arises. Symbols are mistaken for fantasy. Metaphors are taken literally. Precision is dismissed as superstition. This misreading is not malicious. It is structural. Without the slow training once required to approach such material, the deeper logic becomes invisible. Thoth's presence recedes not because it is absent, but because the observer lacks calibration. Calibration, in the ancient sense, was achieved through time. Apprenticeship could last decades. Observation preceded interpretation. Error was expected and corrected patiently. There was no urgency to innovate. Continuity mattered more than novelty. This stands in stark contrast to later paradigms where progress is measured by speed and disruption. Under those conditions, the Thothian approach appears inefficient, even regressive. Yet inefficiency, in this context, was a safeguard. It prevented premature application of incomplete understanding. It slowed down consequences. It ensured that knowledge matured alongside responsibility. When these safeguards erode, systems become powerful but brittle. They expand rapidly, then fracture unexpectedly. History is filled with such cycles, each one echoing the same lesson. Precision ignored eventually demands attention. This pattern suggests that Thoth's wisdom operates less like a doctrine and more like a feedback mechanism. When alignment drifts, consequences accumulate. When consequences become unbearable, recalibration occurs. The God of wisdom does not intervene to prevent collapse. He emerges to interpret it, to explain what went wrong, to preserve the lesson for whatever comes next. In this sense, catastrophe and wisdom are linked, not because disaster is desirable, but because it strips away excess. It exposes underlying structures. It forces reevaluation. Ancient myths often place Thoth at moments of transition, after conflict, after flood, after judgment. He records what remains. He does not mourn what is lost. Mourning is human. Recording is his task. As the narrative continues, this role will become increasingly significant. For the story of Thoth is not only about the accumulation of knowledge, but about its survival through loss. About how memory is carried forward when continuity fails. About how wisdom learns to speak softly enough to endure silence. And in that silence, between collapse and renewal, the ancient scribe waits again. not to command, not to rescue, but to measure carefully what can still be preserved, and to prepare it for minds that do not yet know they will one day need to remember. That preparation is never hurried. What survives collapse does so quietly, often unnoticed by those living through the transition. When empires fragment and belief systems harden, wisdom rarely travels in triumph. It moves in fragments, embedded in marginal texts, encoded in symbols that appear harmless or obsolete. Thoth's legacy follows this path repeatedly, slipping beneath the surface whenever attention turns away from maintenance and toward dominance. In these periods, knowledge is often preserved by individuals rather than institutions. Scribes become monks, astronomers become astrologers, record keepers become chroniclers whose work seems quaint until it becomes indispensable again. The function remains the same even as the social role shifts. Someone must keep track. Someone must notice drift. Someone must remember what was once aligned and how it came undone. This quiet continuity challenges the idea that wisdom advances linearly. Instead, it suggests a rhythm of compression and release. Knowledge expands until it exceeds the capacity of its containers. Then it collapses inward, condensing into symbols, parables, and formulas that can survive pressure. Thoth, as the embodiment of this process, is present at both extremes. He oversees expansion through careful notation and contraction through selective preservation. Selective preservation is not censorship, it is triage. When everything cannot be saved, choices must be made. The ancient texts reflect this reality. They focus less on narrative detail and more on method. How to observe, how to record, how to correct. These instructions are portable. They can be applied to new contexts long after their original references have faded. This is why Thoth's wisdom adapts so easily across eras. It does not insist on a fixed worldview. It insists on a disciplined approach. Discipline, however, is rarely popular. It demands patience in a world that rewards speed. It demands humility in a culture that celebrates certainty. This tension ensures that Thoth's influence will always feel marginal, resurfacing only when excess becomes unsustainable. Wisdom, in this sense, is not a constant presence. It is a corrective force that appears when imbalance reaches a critical point. This perspective reframes the God of wisdom once more. Thoth is not a source of answers. He is a custodian of questions. He preserves the conditions under which meaningful inquiry remains possible. When questions disappear, when systems no longer tolerate uncertainty, correction becomes impossible. Collapse follows not because answers were wrong, but because questions were no longer allowed. As the story moves forward, attention will turn toward how these ancient principles resurface in unexpected ways, in scientific revolutions, in philosophical resets, in moments when humanity is forced to admit that its measurements were incomplete. Each of these moments carries the faint signature of the old scribe, reminding those who are willing to listen that wisdom is less about knowing where you are going and more about knowing precisely where you stand. Knowing precisely where you stand becomes increasingly difficult as perspectives multiply. The more angles from which reality is examined, the easier it becomes to mistake abundance for clarity. In such conditions, wisdom is no longer threatened by ignorance, but by saturation. Too many models compete. Too many explanations coexist without resolution. Measurement becomes selective. Data is filtered to support preference rather than alignment. This is a subtle form of forgetting, one that does not erase memory, but fragments it. The ancient world anticipated this danger intuitively. Its emphasis on proportion was not aesthetic alone. It was cognitive. Balance was a way of preventing any single perspective from overwhelming the whole. Thoth's role as mediator reflects this concern. He does not choose sides. He maintains symmetry. When one force grows too dominant, he introduces correction, not by suppression, but by recontextualization. This approach stands in contrast to later habits of thought that seek definitive answers. Final theories, ultimate truths, permanent solutions. These ambitions are understandable, but they conflict with the reality of a universe that remains dynamic. Thoth's wisdom accepts motion as fundamental. Stability is not achieved by freezing systems in place, but by allowing controlled adaptation. Calendars must be adjusted, records must be revised, assumptions must be revisited. Precision is not a destination, it is a practice. The Egyptian reverence for record-keeping reflects this philosophy. Archives were not monuments to certainty, they were tools for correction. Errors were expected. What mattered was whether they were noticed in time. This mindset transforms failure from a threat into a signal. Mistakes become information. Drift becomes data. In this way, wisdom remains resilient even in the face of change. As the narrative deepens, the figure of Thoth begins to dissolve further into abstraction. He is no longer needed as a character to convey these ideas. His presence is felt in the method itself, in the insistence that truth be revisable, in the refusal to confuse tradition with accuracy, in the quiet acknowledgement that every system, no matter how refined, will eventually require recalibration. This realization carries a humbling implication. No civilization escapes entropy. No body of knowledge remains perfectly aligned indefinitely. Wisdom lies not in denying this fact, but in preparing for it. Thoth's ancient task was never to preserve perfection. It was to ensure that when imperfection emerged, there existed a way to recognize it and respond intelligently. Such preparation is rarely dramatic. It does not announce itself with revelation or prophecy. It unfolds through habits of attention, through careful language, through respect for limits. These qualities are easy to overlook, yet their absence becomes painfully obvious in moments of crisis. When systems fail, when narratives collapse, when certainty evaporates, the need for disciplined observation returns with urgency. And so the story of Thoth continues, not as a tale bound to the past, but as a quiet framework underlying humanity's ongoing attempt to live within time without being consumed by it. The God of wisdom recedes once more, not into obscurity, but into practice itself, waiting to be recognized not by name, but by those who still value the difficult art of measuring honestly in a world that prefers conclusions over corrections. Measuring honestly becomes a form of resistance when certainty is rewarded more than accuracy. In such environments, wisdom often appears slow, hesitant, even weak. But this appearance is deceptive. What looks like hesitation is calibration. What looks like restraint is foresight. Thoth's ancient influence is most visible precisely where knowledge refuses to rush toward conclusion, where understanding is allowed to mature before being applied. This maturity requires a particular relationship with uncertainty. Rather than treating the unknown as an enemy to be conquered, Thoth's tradition treats it as a boundary to be respected. Boundaries define systems. Without them, meaning dissolves. The Egyptians understood this intuitively. Their cosmology was not an attempt to explain everything, but to frame what could be engaged safely. Beyond that frame lay mystery, not as a challenge, but as a reminder of limitation. As later cultures inherit fragments of this worldview, the emphasis shifts. Mystery becomes either romanticized or dismissed. It is no longer integrated into method. This separation weakens the corrective feedback that once kept knowledge aligned with consequence. When mystery is denied, overconfidence grows. When it is fetishized, precision erodes. Thoth's role was to hold both in balance, to acknowledge what cannot be known while refining what can. This balance is evident in ancient approaches to astronomy. The sky was observed relentlessly, yet interpretations remained cautious. Patterns were recorded without assumption of control. Prediction existed, but it was probabilistic, not absolute. The heavens offered tendencies, not commands. This humility preserved alignment between observation and expectation. It prevented disappointment from becoming denial. As time progresses, humanity's tools improve. Instruments extend perception beyond natural limits. Data accumulates at unprecedented scales, yet the same ancient tension persists. The ability to observe does not guarantee the ability to interpret wisely. Without calibration, increased resolution amplifies error rather than reducing it. Thoth's wisdom becomes more relevant, not less, in such conditions. This relevance is often unrecognized because it lacks spectacle. There is no dramatic revelation attached to recalibration. No mythic hero emerges when a model is corrected. Progress through correction feels anticlimactic. And yet, it is the only kind that endures. Every stable system, ancient or modern, depends on countless small adjustments made by those willing to admit imperfection. The God of wisdom in this light is not a figure of inspiration, but of maintenance. His domain is not enlightenment, but endurance. He does not promise transcendence. He offers continuity. This may seem modest, but it is foundational. Without continuity, transcendence collapses into illusion. As the narrative advances, attention will turn toward the cycles that repeat this lesson across history. How civilizations forget the value of maintenance. How collapse reintroduces humility. How wisdom survives by becoming less visible, less celebrated, but more deeply embedded in the structures that quietly support life across generations. In these cycles, Thoth never disappears. He withdraws, allowing excess to reveal its own limits. And when those limits are reached, when certainty fractures and systems falter, the ancient scribe steps forward once again, not as a god returning, but as a method rediscovered. Rediscovered methods rarely announce their antiquity. They present themselves as innovations, born of necessity rather than inheritance. This is one of the quiet ironies of wisdom. Each generation believes it has arrived at correction independently, unaware that it is retracing a path walked many times before. Thoth's influence persists precisely because it does not demand recognition. It functions whether remembered or not. This pattern becomes especially clear in moments of systemic recalibration. When prevailing assumptions fail, attention returns to fundamentals: observation over interpretation, measurement over belief, record over rhetoric. These priorities feel modern when rediscovered, yet they are ancient to the core. They echo a worldview that understood survival as a matter of alignment rather than dominance. The God of wisdom is present in every return to first principles. What distinguishes these moments from true renewal is whether the lesson is integrated or merely applied temporarily. History shows that correction without humility tends to be short-lived. Systems adjust just enough to stabilize, then resume accelerating toward excess. Thoth's wisdom is not satisfied with temporary fixes. It demands structural change, not dramatic reform, but sustained attentiveness. Attentiveness, however, is difficult to institutionalize. It relies on individuals who value accuracy over recognition. Such individuals rarely shape dominant narratives. They work at the margins, refining, revising, maintaining. Their contributions are often invisible until they are absent. Only when error compounds do their efforts become noticeable in retrospect. Ancient societies honored this role explicitly. The scribe was revered not for creativity, but for reliability. Trust was earned through consistency. Over time, this reverence faded. Creativity came to overshadow maintenance. Innovation eclipsed preservation. In this shift, Thoth's presence became increasingly subtle, embedded in practices rather than symbols. Yet even when unacknowledged, the function remains essential. No archive survives without caretakers. No calendar remains accurate without adjustment. No language remains precise without correction. These tasks may lack glamour, but they sustain coherence. Thoth's wisdom lives in these quiet acts, repeated endlessly, rarely celebrated. As the narrative unfolds further, the focus will turn toward the consequences of neglecting this wisdom. how systems that prize speed over accuracy accumulate invisible flaws, how narratives detached from measurement drift into instability, and how, inevitably, reality asserts itself, demanding recalibration regardless of belief. In those moments, when correction can no longer be postponed, humanity often experiences a strange familiarity, a sense that the solution feels old, even when newly articulated. This is not coincidence. It is recognition. The ancient scribe's method has been found again, waiting patiently beneath layers of excess, ready to guide attention back toward balance once more. That familiarity is often accompanied by discomfort. Recognition implies responsibility. To rediscover an old method is to confront the fact that it was once known and later neglected. This realization unsettles the narrative of constant progress. It introduces the possibility that advancement without memory is not advancement at all, but repetition disguised as novelty. Thoth's wisdom quietly undermines the illusion that history moves only forward. In ancient thought, forgetting was not merely the loss of information, it was a moral failure, not because memory itself was sacred, but because forgetting disrupted alignment. When lessons paid for through suffering were ignored, suffering returned. This was not interpreted as punishment, but as correction. The universe, in this view, does not retaliate. It responds. Thoth's role was to ensure that the response could be understood. Understanding consequence requires continuity of record. Without it, each generation mistakes recurring patterns for unprecedented events. Crisis becomes surprise rather than signal. Wisdom becomes reactive instead of preventative. The ancient Egyptians feared this condition deeply. Their obsession with preservation was not nostalgia. It was strategy. They believed that memory was humanity's only defense against unnecessary repetition. As this belief fades, societies become vulnerable to the same errors repeating under new names. Power concentrates, language distorts, measurement becomes selective. When imbalance grows severe, correction arrives abruptly, often experienced as collapse. In these moments, Thoth's influence resurfaces not through reverence, but through necessity. Systems must be rebuilt. Records must be restored. Accuracy must replace assertion. This rebuilding phase often gives rise to renewed respect for method. What was once dismissed as pedantic becomes essential. Audits replace slogans. Data replaces declarations. This shift feels clinical, even cold, but it is stabilizing. Emotion can return later. First, alignment must be restored. Thoth's wisdom is always applied in this order. Stabilize, then flourish. Yet stabilization alone is not enough. Without integration into culture, correction remains fragile. The ancients understood this. They embedded wisdom into myth, so it could be remembered emotionally as well as intellectually. Thoth's image, his symbols, his stories were mnemonic devices. They ensured that precision had a face, a presence that could be recalled even when attention waned. Modern systems often lack such mnemonic anchors. Method becomes abstract, detached from narrative. This detachment makes wisdom harder to transmit across generations. Techniques survive, but their underlying ethic erodes. Efficiency replaces care. Optimization replaces understanding. The ancient scribe's quiet caution is lost amid acceleration. As the story continues, this tension between method and meaning will deepen. The narrative will explore how wisdom requires not only correct tools, but a cultural environment that values their careful use. Without that environment, even the most refined systems drift toward misuse. And once again, when drift becomes undeniable, the ancient pattern repeats. Attention returns to balance. Measurement regains authority. Memory is consulted. Thoth does not appear as a god descending from myth. He emerges as a recognition, a realization that wisdom was never lost, only ignored, patiently waiting for the moment when accuracy matters more than certainty. That moment arrives quietly, often without ceremony. It does not announce itself as awakening or revelation. It feels more like fatigue, a collective weariness with explanations that no longer align with lived reality. In this fatigue, attention slows, certainty loosens its grip, space opens for reconsideration. This is where Thoth's wisdom finds its way back in, not as doctrine, but as relief. Relief because accurate measurement removes the burden of illusion. It replaces anxiety with orientation. When systems are understood clearly, even their limitations become manageable. The ancients valued this clarity deeply. To know the boundaries of a system was to know how to live within it without constant friction. Thoth's role was never to promise freedom from constraint, but to make constraint intelligible. This perspective contrasts sharply with later ideals that equate wisdom with transcendence. Escaping limitation becomes the goal. Mastery is defined as dominance rather than harmony. Under such ideals, constraint is treated as failure. Yet reality continues to impose limits regardless of belief. The refusal to acknowledge them does not remove their influence. It merely delays correction. Ancient cosmology accepted limits as fundamental. The sky had patterns, but also boundaries. Time had cycles, but also endpoints. Knowledge had depth, but also thresholds beyond which speculation replaced observation. Thoth stood at these thresholds, marking them clearly. His wisdom lay in knowing when to proceed and when to stop. This restraint preserved coherence. As this restraint disappears from cultural memory, curiosity becomes reckless. Exploration accelerates without sufficient calibration. When consequences emerge, they are often attributed to bad luck or external forces rather than misalignment. This misattribution prolongs instability. Thoth's ancient corrective method would have identified the source earlier, but only if attention had remained disciplined. Discipline, however, is not enforced by force. It is cultivated through value. When accuracy is respected, discipline follows naturally. When speed and certainty are rewarded instead, discipline erodes. This dynamic explains why wisdom often feels countercultural. It resists trends. It slows momentum. It asks uncomfortable questions at moments when enthusiasm demands affirmation. In every era, there are individuals who embody this resistance instinctively. They question assumptions. They test measurements. They preserve records others consider obsolete. These individuals rarely see themselves as inheritors of ancient gods. And yet, in function, they are precisely that. They carry forward the same quiet responsibility Thoth once symbolized. As the narrative continues, the focus will turn toward the cyclical nature of this inheritance, how each generation produces its own scribes, often reluctantly, how wisdom persists not through reverence for the past, but through repeated rediscovery of its necessity, and how the God of wisdom, long absent from temples, continues to live through the discipline of those who still choose to measure carefully in a world that rarely pauses to ask if it should. Choosing to pause is an act that grows rarer as systems become more complex. Momentum takes on a life of its own. Processes accelerate beyond the comprehension of those who depend on them. In such conditions, wisdom is often mistaken for obstruction. Those who slow the pace are seen as resistant, cautious, even fearful. Yet from the perspective of Thoth's ancient function, pause is not hesitation, it is inspection. Inspection is how alignment is maintained. Without it, error compounds invisibly. The ancients understood this well. They built pauses into their calendars, their rituals, their architecture. Intercalary days corrected drift. Festivals interrupted labor. Reflection was not optional. It was structural. These interruptions were not inefficiencies. They were safeguards against runaway imbalance. When such safeguards are removed, systems appear efficient until they fail suddenly. Collapse then feels inexplicable, as if it arrived from nowhere. In reality, it has been accumulating quietly. Thoth's wisdom addresses this blind spot directly. It insists that stability is not achieved through uninterrupted motion, but through rhythmic correction. Movement must be balanced by stillness, action by review. This rhythm mirrors natural cycles. Breath expands and contracts. Tides rise and fall. Night interrupts day. To ignore these patterns is to work against the structure of reality itself. The ancient scribe did not impose order on the world. He observed its rhythms and translated them into systems humans could follow. When those systems fall out of sync, discomfort arises. When ignored, disorder follows. As civilizations progress, there is a tendency to believe that technology can replace rhythm with control. Continuous operation becomes ideal. Systems run without pause. Correction is deferred until failure forces intervention. This approach treats collapse as acceptable collateral rather than preventable outcome. Thoth's wisdom rejects this logic. It views collapse as evidence of neglected attention. Attention, in this sense, is not vigilance alone. It is care. Care requires emotional investment in accuracy. It requires valuing truth even when inconvenient. It requires acknowledging limits before they are enforced by consequence. These qualities are difficult to sustain collectively, especially when reward structures favor expansion over maintenance. And yet, attention persists. It survives in overlooked corners, in practices that value review over reaction, in disciplines that insist on verification rather than assumption. These practices rarely claim lineage from ancient myth, but they fulfill the same role. They keep systems legible. They prevent knowledge from dissolving into noise. As the story advances, the focus will turn toward how this legibility becomes a form of inheritance, not through bloodline or belief, but through habit. How ways of thinking persist even when their origins are forgotten, and how Thoth's presence, once embodied as a god, now resides within the quiet choice to pause, to check, and to ask whether what appears functional is truly aligned. This is where wisdom lives now, not in grand revelation, but in restraint, not in certainty, but in calibration. And as long as these qualities endure, the ancient scribe remains at his post, continuing his work unseen, patiently guarding the fragile continuity of meaning across time. Guarding continuity across time becomes more difficult as time itself is redefined. When cycles give way to straight lines, when beginnings and endings replace recurrence, the logic of maintenance weakens. Linear thinking encourages accumulation without return. Progress becomes a forward rush rather than a balanced motion. In this framework, wisdom is pressured to justify itself through results rather than stability. Thoth's ancient role becomes increasingly subtle, almost invisible, because its success leaves no dramatic trace. The ancients expected repetition. Seasons returned, floods recurred, stars retraced their paths. Memory was therefore designed to loop. Lessons were not learned once and applied forever. They were revisited, refined, and reaffirmed. This cyclical engagement kept knowledge flexible without becoming unstable. When cycles are dismissed as primitive, this flexibility is lost. Systems harden, assumptions fossilize, correction becomes disruptive rather than routine. This rigidity introduces a new vulnerability. When change finally arrives, it feels catastrophic rather than corrective. Collapse is experienced as failure instead of feedback. In such moments, the absence of Thoth's influence becomes evident, not because he has departed, but because the culture no longer recognizes the value of recalibration. Wisdom is expected to provide answers, not adjustments. Yet adjustment is the only response that reality consistently accepts. Environments change, variables shift, contexts evolve. Systems that cannot adapt gradually are forced to adapt abruptly. The ancient scribe's method was designed to avoid this shock. By embedding correction into regular practice, imbalance was addressed before it became visible as crisis. As modern narratives prioritize innovation, they often treat maintenance as secondary. Upkeep is deferred. Review is minimized. Documentation is undervalued. These choices accumulate cost quietly. When failure occurs, attention turns urgently toward recovery, often rediscovering principles that had been neglected. Accuracy is suddenly prized. Records are reconstructed. Measurements are questioned. The old method returns, not as philosophy, but as emergency response. This recurring pattern suggests that wisdom functions best when it is ordinary, when correction is unremarkable, when review is habitual rather than reactive. Thoth's ideal world was not one without error, but one where error never had time to grow dangerous. This ideal is difficult to sustain because it lacks spectacle. Its success is defined by absence. Nothing breaks, nothing collapses, nothing demands heroism. Heroism, however, is culturally attractive. Stories favor crisis over continuity, saviors over caretakers. Thoth does not fit easily into such narratives. He prevents the conditions that produce heroes. His work makes drama unnecessary. This may explain why his presence fades during eras that glorify disruption. Wisdom that averts disaster receives little recognition, and still the function persists. In every system that values review, in every discipline that corrects itself, in every moment when someone pauses to verify before proceeding, these acts carry forward the ancient responsibility once symbolized by a god with a writing palette and the moon as his measure. As the narrative moves onward, the lens will widen again, turning toward cycles of collapse and renewal on a broader scale, floods of myth, resets of memory, and the enduring question of how much knowledge can be carried through catastrophe without losing its integrity. In these moments, the ancient scribe's task becomes most critical and his quiet vigilance most profound. Catastrophe, when it arrives, strips systems to their essentials. Excess is burned away. Complexity collapses into necessity. In these moments, what survives reveals what was truly foundational. The ancients understood this intuitively. Myths of flood, fire, and darkness were not only stories of destruction, they were stories of filtration, of reality testing itself. Thoth's presence in these narratives is never accidental. He appears not to prevent catastrophe, but to ensure that something intelligible remains afterward. In Egyptian thought, cosmic disruption was always followed by reordering. Chaos was not evil. It was a condition that demanded response. The danger lay not in disorder itself, but in failing to learn from it. Thoth's task, therefore, was archival. He recorded the sequence. He preserved the logic of what led to collapse. Without this record, renewal would repeat the same errors under new forms. This idea transforms catastrophe from meaningless loss into information. Painful information, but information nonetheless. Flood myths across cultures reflect this logic. Waters erase boundaries, but they also reset conditions. Afterward, the land must be measured again. Time must be recalibrated. Memory must be reconstructed. These are all Thothian acts. They restore orientation after disorientation. What matters most in these moments is not how much is saved, but how clearly it is preserved. A single accurate measure can rebuild an entire system. A flawed one can doom it to repeat failure. This is why ancient preservation focused on method rather than detail. The specific shape of a temple could change. The principle governing its alignment could not. Thoth guarded principles. Principles survive because they are compressible. They can be carried through disaster without losing coherence. This compressibility is what allows wisdom to endure across resets. It becomes portable. It hides in stories, numbers, proportions. It waits to be unpacked when conditions allow. Thoth's genius was recognizing what could survive pressure and what could not. As humanity confronts its own cycles of disruption, this ancient lesson grows more relevant. The scale may change, the causes may differ, but the pattern remains. Systems overextend, correction is delayed, collapse arrives. The question is not whether this will happen, but what will be preserved through it. In this light, the God of wisdom is not a relic of a mythic past. He is a guide for transitions that have not yet fully unfolded. His ancient task continues wherever there is an effort to record honestly in the face of loss, wherever someone chooses clarity over comfort, wherever continuity is valued more than narrative. As the story moves forward, attention will turn toward how these principles were encoded deliberately for survival, how ancient knowledge was designed to pass through dark ages, how wisdom learned to hide in plain sight, and how the figure once called Thoth became a blueprint for preserving meaning when the world itself must be rebuilt again. That blueprint is subtle by necessity. Knowledge designed to survive collapse cannot announce its importance loudly. It must appear ordinary, even obsolete, to avoid being discarded or misused. The ancients understood this paradox well. What is too powerful attracts destruction. What is too visible invites distortion. Thoth's wisdom learned to cloak itself in humility, embedding its core principles within forms that could pass unnoticed through hostile eras. This is why so much ancient knowledge appears fragmented or symbolic. It is not because the ancients were incapable of clarity, but because clarity without context can be dangerous. Symbols compress meaning. They allow information to be stored densely, awaiting the right interpretive conditions. A symbol misunderstood is inert. A symbol understood prematurely can be destabilizing. Thoth's method balanced these risks carefully. Consider the persistence of ratios, cycles, and correspondences across cultures separated by time and geography. These are not coincidences. They are survivals. They endure because they are abstract enough to remain relevant, yet precise enough to reconstruct systems when needed. Geometry survives where stories fade. Calendars outlast kings. Measurement outlives ideology. Thoth's imprint is strongest in these durable forms. This durability changes how wisdom should be recognized. It is tempting to look for lost libraries or forbidden texts as the carriers of ancient knowledge, but Thoth's legacy is more often found in frameworks than in archives, in how questions are structured, in how error is addressed, in how uncertainty is tolerated. These habits of mind are harder to destroy than any manuscript. As civilizations rebuild after collapse, they rarely begin with philosophy. They begin with orientation. When does the day begin? How long is the year? Where should structures face? How should records be kept? These foundational questions must be answered before culture can flourish again. Thoth's ancient role emerges naturally here, not as myth, but as necessity. Someone must measure, someone must record, someone must ensure continuity. This is why the God of wisdom reappears so consistently at the margins of history. He is present at beginnings disguised as endings, at renewals mistaken for inventions. Each time humanity believes it is starting anew, it quietly reaches back for methods it never truly abandoned. Thoth's wisdom returns because it was never gone. It was waiting. Waiting is perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of this legacy. It implies passivity, but it is anything but. Waiting is strategic restraint. It is the decision not to intervene until conditions allow correction to be received. Thoth does not force wisdom upon those who cannot use it. He preserves it until attention matures enough to recognize its value. As the narrative prepares to enter the next phase, the focus will shift from preservation to interpretation. How later generations misunderstood what survived. How symbols were mistaken for superstition. How method was confused with myth. And how, within these misunderstandings, fragments of profound insight continued to exert quiet influence, shaping thought even as their origins were forgotten. In this unfolding, the story of Thoth moves closer to the present moment, not as a distant god, but as an inherited responsibility, one that asks, with patient insistence, whether humanity is finally prepared to recognize that wisdom has never been about knowing everything, but about knowing what must be carried forward and how carefully it must be held. How carefully something is held becomes decisive when the world itself begins to shift. In ancient memory, there is no illusion that stability is permanent. Civilizations rise knowing, at least intuitively, that they will one day fall. What matters is not avoiding this fate, but shaping what remains afterward. This awareness gives rise to myths of great resets, moments when accumulated imbalance forces reality to reorganize itself. Thoth's presence in these stories is consistent and restrained. He does not resist the reset, he prepares for it. In Egyptian cosmology, order is not the absence of chaos. It is the successful negotiation with it. Chaos is primordial, ever present, never eliminated. It presses constantly against structure, testing its coherence. When structure becomes rigid or careless, chaos does not attack. It seeps in. Flood myths describe this process symbolically. Waters rise not out of malice, but because boundaries were neglected. Thoth's role is not to dam the flood, but to measure what the flood reveals. This distinction matters. Many later traditions frame catastrophe as punishment. The Egyptian worldview is more diagnostic. Collapse is a symptom. Something drifted, something was mismeasured, something was recorded inaccurately or ignored. The flood, the fire, the darkness merely exposed the misalignment that already existed. Thoth stands at this moment as witness, not judge. He ensures that the lesson is not lost in the trauma. Ancient texts suggest that after great disruptions, knowledge had to be reassembled from fragments, calendars recalculated, boundaries redrawn, language simplified. These acts are not glamorous, but they are essential. Without them, renewal becomes impossible. Thoth's wisdom emerges here as a technology of recovery. It provides continuity when memory is fractured. What survives catastrophe is rarely what was most impressive. Monuments crumble, names vanish, power dissolves. What endures are abstractions, ratios, counts, sequences, methods. These are portable. They can be carried by a few minds, a handful of symbols. Thoth's ancient genius was recognizing this long before disaster arrived. He curated survivability. This curation suggests intentionality. Knowledge was not merely accumulated, it was filtered. Not everything deserved to survive. Excess detail, local narratives, personal glory. These were allowed to fade. What mattered was what could rebuild orientation. This selectivity is often misunderstood as secrecy. In truth, it was foresight. As the narrative enters this phase of collapse and reset, Thoth's function becomes more visible precisely because everything else falls away. When certainty dissolves, measurement returns. When power fails, record-keeping persists. When belief fractures, method endures. The God of wisdom, at this stage, is no longer a figure of teaching. He becomes a bridge between worlds, between what was and what might be rebuilt, between memory and possibility. And as humanity stands repeatedly at these thresholds, the ancient scribe continues his quiet work, ensuring that the future is never entirely severed from the past. That bridge between what was and what may be rebuilt is narrow, fragile, and easily overlooked. It is crossed not by armies or crowds, but by fragments of understanding carried through disruption. In ancient accounts of cosmic resets, survival is never accidental. Those who endure do so because they are aligned with rhythm rather than force. They know when to withdraw, when to preserve, and when to wait. Thoth's wisdom operates entirely within this narrow margin. Waiting after catastrophe is not passive, it is observational. The world must be allowed to settle before it can be measured again. Floodwaters recede, ash cools, silence replaces noise. Only then can orientation return. In this pause, the ancient scribe's function is at its purest. He does not rebuild immediately. He listens. He notes what remains consistent. He identifies what still holds shape when everything else has dissolved. This listening is critical because not all losses are equal. Some structures fail because they were misaligned. Others are swept away despite being sound. Wisdom lies in distinguishing between the two. Without this discernment, renewal repeats error or discards what should have been preserved. Thoth's presence ensures that rebuilding begins from principles that proved resilient under pressure. Ancient myths often describe survivors emerging with limited knowledge, yet sufficient to begin again. They carry seeds, measurements, names of stars, counts of days. These are not sentimental artifacts. They are tools of orientation. With them, time can be tracked, seasons anticipated, space organized. Society can reform gradually rather than chaotically. Thoth's wisdom prioritizes these tools above all else. This emphasis reveals a deeper truth. Civilization does not begin with ideology. It begins with coordination, agreement on time, agreement on space, agreement on record. Without these, cooperation collapses. The God of wisdom understood that belief systems could evolve later. First, reality had to be made legible again. As humanity rebuilds, there is often a temptation to mythologize the catastrophe itself, to assign blame, to moralize loss. While these narratives may offer comfort, they risk obscuring the practical lessons embedded in collapse. Thoth's approach resists this drift. He preserves sequence over sentiment, cause over drama. In doing so, he provides something less emotionally satisfying, but far more enduring: understanding. Understanding transforms trauma into instruction. It allows future generations to recognize early signs of imbalance rather than waiting for disaster to confirm them. This is the true value of memory in ancient thought. Not reverence for suffering, but prevention of its repetition. Thoth's quiet work ensures that pain is not wasted. As this cycle completes, the story begins to echo itself. Collapse leads to preservation. Preservation enables renewal. Renewal eventually drifts. Drift invites correction. Correction, if ignored, returns as collapse. Thoth does not break this cycle. He documents it. He ensures that each turn carries forward a clearer record than the last. And so, as the narrative moves deeper into the theme of reset and return, the God of wisdom remains steady at the center of motion, not stopping the wheel, not accelerating it, but marking its passage with care, so that even in forgetting, humanity leaves behind enough clarity to find its way back again. Finding the way back is never a return to what once was. Renewal does not restore the past, it reinterprets it. After each reset, memory survives in altered form, shaped by loss and necessity. Thoth's wisdom anticipates this distortion. It does not attempt to preserve history intact. It preserves orientation. Direction matters more than detail. Knowing how to begin again outweighs knowing exactly what was lost. This is why ancient knowledge often appears incomplete. Gaps are not failures. They are adaptations. What remains is what could be carried, what could be remembered without infrastructure, what could be reconstructed by minds working under constraint. Thoth's role was to ensure that these fragments formed a coherent foundation rather than a collection of relics. Coherence is fragile in the aftermath of collapse. Trauma narrows perception. Urgency overrides reflection. In such conditions, the temptation to rebuild quickly is strong, but haste reintroduces imbalance. The ancient scribe's method counters this impulse. He prioritizes sequencing. First measurement, then alignment, only afterward expansion. This order is repeated across mythic resets, quietly reinforcing a pattern learned through experience. As societies rebuild, memory often becomes myth. Practical lessons are retold as stories. Ratios become gods. Cycles become narratives. This transformation is not degeneration. It is translation. Myth carries method in emotional form, ensuring it survives in cultures where literacy or precision may be temporarily lost. Thoth's wisdom accommodates this shift. He allows meaning to move from calculation into symbol, trusting that attentive minds will eventually reverse the process. This trust reflects deep confidence in human cognition. Despite repeated collapse, ancient traditions assume that understanding can be recovered, not instantly, not universally, but eventually. Wisdom, in this view, is not fragile. It is patient. It waits across generations, embedded in language, ritual, and habit, until conditions allow its reemergence. Yet patience has limits. When distortions accumulate unchecked, when symbols are severed entirely from their functional roots, confusion deepens. Ritual becomes empty. Myth becomes dogma. In these moments, Thoth's corrective influence intensifies. Attention is drawn back to structure. Questions reappear. Measurement regains authority. This oscillation between symbol and method is not failure. it is rhythm. Understanding this rhythm changes how collapse itself is perceived. It is no longer the end of meaning, but part of its transmission. Loss filters. Silence clarifies. When noise falls away, what remains speaks more clearly. Thoth's ancient task is not to prevent forgetting entirely, but to ensure that forgetting does not erase the path to remembering. As the narrative moves forward, the focus will turn toward how these cycles of loss and recovery influenced later interpretations of wisdom, how ancient symbols were re-examined by new minds, how fragments once dismissed as myth were recognized as encoded instruction, and how, through this process, the God of wisdom continued to guide understanding without ever demanding to be named. Guiding understanding without demanding a name is perhaps the most enduring aspect of Thoth's legacy. When wisdom becomes anonymous, it gains resilience. It no longer depends on reverence or belief to survive. It functions wherever its principles are applied, regardless of whether their origin is acknowledged. This anonymity allows ancient knowledge to pass through cultures that might otherwise reject it outright. As new civilizations emerge from the remnants of older ones, they often inherit fragments without context. Calendrical systems persist, but their cosmological meanings fade. Legal principles survive, but their ethical foundations shift. Language retains structure, but loses memory of why it was shaped that way. In these fragments, Thoth's influence remains embedded, quietly shaping thought from beneath the surface. This buried influence can be difficult to detect because it lacks narrative cohesion. It does not present itself as a single tradition. Instead, it appears as convergent solutions to recurring problems. Different cultures, facing similar challenges, arrive at comparable methods of measurement, record-keeping, and correction. From the perspective of myth, this looks like diffusion. From the perspective of function, it is inevitability. Thoth represents this inevitability, not as a historical agent moving between lands, but as a pattern that reasserts itself wherever intelligence confronts duration. Time demands accounting. Complexity demands documentation. Interaction demands mediation. These demands are not cultural preferences. They are structural pressures. Wisdom emerges as the response to those pressures. Over time, however, responses can drift away from their original purpose. Methods become rituals without understanding. Symbols become decorations. Systems persist because they are familiar, not because they remain accurate. This is the slow decay Thoth was meant to counteract. His presence is felt most strongly when attention returns to function, when questions are asked not about tradition, but about effectiveness. This return often begins with discomfort. Discovering that long-trusted systems no longer align with reality is destabilizing. It threatens identity and authority. As a result, early correctors are frequently resisted. They are seen as disruptive rather than restorative. Yet history shows that such resistance only delays necessary adjustment. Reality does not negotiate indefinitely. The ancient scribe's wisdom offers a way through this tension. By framing correction as maintenance rather than rebellion, it reduces defensiveness. Error is not framed as failure, but as information. Adjustment becomes routine rather than humiliating. This mindset fosters resilience. Systems that expect correction survive longer than those that demand perfection. As the narrative approaches its final movements, this principle becomes central. The God of wisdom was never meant to be worshipped as an ideal. He was meant to normalize imperfection, to teach that drift is natural but neglect is not. That correction is not an admission of weakness, but an expression of care. In this light, Thoth's story ceases to be ancient history. It becomes a living framework, one that continues to shape how humanity responds to complexity, uncertainty, and change. And as long as there are those willing to measure honestly, to record faithfully, and to revise without fear, the ancient scribe's work remains unfinished, quietly unfolding with each careful act of attention. That unfinished work carries an implicit question into every age, not whether humanity will err, but whether it will notice. Error itself is inevitable. Drift is unavoidable. What determines survival is responsiveness. Thoth's wisdom centers on this responsiveness, on the capacity to recognize deviation before it hardens into catastrophe. This capacity does not arise from intelligence alone. It arises from humility toward measurement. Humility in this sense is not self-doubt. It is respect for reality's complexity. The ancients did not assume the world would conform to their models. They expected their models to be revised. This expectation shaped a relationship with knowledge that remained flexible without becoming arbitrary. Thoth's role was to safeguard this posture, ensuring that confidence never outran verification. As centuries passed, this posture became increasingly difficult to sustain. Power rewards certainty. Authority favors permanence. Institutions prefer stability of narrative over accuracy of record. Under these pressures, correction is reframed as threat. Those who point out misalignment are marginalized. Measurement becomes politicized. Truth is filtered through convenience. These conditions mark the gradual withdrawal of Thoth's influence from public life. Yet withdrawal does not mean disappearance. Wisdom relocates. It moves from centers of power to edges of practice. It survives in disciplines that cannot afford illusion. Navigation, medicine, engineering, agriculture. In these fields, error produces immediate consequence. Measurement must remain honest. Record-keeping must remain precise. Thoth's ancient function persists here, quietly enforced by reality itself. This persistence suggests that wisdom does not depend on moral consensus. It depends on consequence. Where consequences are unavoidable, alignment is valued. Where consequences can be deferred or displaced, misalignment proliferates. The God of wisdom appears most clearly where error cannot hide behind narrative. This is why his presence often feels technical rather than spiritual in later eras. But the technical and the spiritual were never separate in ancient thought. Precision was sacred because it protected life. Measurement was holy because it preserved balance. Thoth embodied this unity. He did not divide knowledge into domains. He treated all accurate understanding as an expression of the same responsibility. To measure truly was to participate in order. As this unity fragments, meaning thins, knowledge becomes specialized, responsibility diffuses. No single actor feels accountable for systemic drift. Collapse then appears sudden, though it has been long prepared. Thoth's wisdom would have noticed the early signs. It would have recorded them. It would have insisted on correction long before failure became unavoidable. This insistence is often unwelcome. It disrupts comfort. It challenges narratives of control. It slows momentum. Yet it is precisely this discomfort that signals wisdom at work. Thoth's presence is not soothing. It is clarifying. It replaces illusion with orientation, and in doing so, removes false security while offering genuine stability. As the story advances, the final movements will turn inward once more, toward the individual inheritor of this ancient responsibility, toward the quiet realization that the God of wisdom does not stand outside humanity, waiting to be remembered, but within it, waiting to be practiced rather than remembered. Wisdom changes character. It ceases to be something inherited passively and becomes something enacted deliberately. This shift places responsibility squarely within the individual, not as burden, but as participation. In ancient terms, to act with wisdom was to align oneself with Ma'at, to become a stabilizing element within a larger system. Thoth's role was never to replace human agency, but to refine it. This refinement begins with attention, not dramatic awareness, but sustained noticing, the ability to detect small inconsistencies before they accumulate, the willingness to pause when something feels slightly misaligned, even if it still appears functional. This sensitivity is difficult to cultivate in environments that reward speed and decisiveness. Yet it is precisely this sensitivity that ancient wisdom prized most. The scribe was trained not to innovate, but to preserve clarity. This training shaped perception itself. Errors became visible sooner. Patterns emerged more readily. Over time, this cultivated a form of intelligence that modern language struggles to name. It was not analytical alone. It was relational. It understood systems as living processes rather than static mechanisms. When this mode of perception fades, systems are treated as objects to be optimized rather than relationships to be maintained. Intervention becomes aggressive. Solutions are imposed rather than adjusted. Thoth's wisdom resists this tendency. It favors subtlety. It recognizes that forcing alignment often creates new distortions elsewhere. True correction works with structure rather than against it. This approach requires patience with ambiguity. Not every discrepancy can be resolved immediately. Some signals require time to clarify. The ancient scribe waited for patterns to repeat before drawing conclusions. He trusted recurrence more than anomaly. This patience prevented overreaction and preserved coherence across longer spans of time. Modern thought often struggles with this restraint. Data arrives constantly. Signals compete. Pressure mounts to respond instantly. In such conditions, the discipline to wait feels counterintuitive, even irresponsible. Yet the cost of constant reaction is fragmentation. Attention scatters, meaning dissolves. Thoth's ancient method offers an alternative. Slow the signal, clarify the pattern, act only when alignment is understood. As the narrative moves closer to its final reflections, the emphasis shifts toward this lived wisdom, not as abstract ideal, but as daily practice. How small acts of accuracy compound over time. How consistent record-keeping outlasts brilliance. How humility toward measurement creates resilience even in uncertain conditions. In this light, the God of wisdom becomes less a figure of myth and more a mirror, a reflection of what attention looks like when it is disciplined, patient, and oriented toward continuity rather than conquest. Thoth does not ask to be believed in. He asks to be enacted, and wherever that enactment occurs, the ancient work continues, quietly stitching coherence into a world that constantly threatens to forget how fragile it is. That fragility becomes most apparent when attention drifts inward toward the self. Ancient wisdom did not separate inner order from outer order. Thought, emotion, action, and consequence were understood as parts of the same continuum. To mismeasure oneself was to mismeasure the world. Thoth's role as recorder extended inward as well as outward. The weighing of the heart was not a metaphor imposed after death. It was a discipline practiced during life. This inward measurement required honesty that could not be delegated. No priest, no scribe, no god could perform it on another's behalf. The individual had to cultivate the ability to observe intention without distortion, to notice where desire bent truth, where fear altered perception, where convenience replaced accuracy. This was the most demanding aspect of wisdom, and the least visible. The ancients believed that inner misalignment eventually expressed itself outwardly. Corrupt records, inflated claims, distorted measures. These were not random failures. They were symptoms of internal drift. Thoth's presence at the scale symbolized this continuity. The same principle that balanced the cosmos also balanced the mind. Order was not imposed, it was reflected. As cultures evolved, this inward discipline often weakened. External systems grew more complex, responsibility diffused. Individuals relied on institutions to maintain balance. While this delegation brought efficiency, it also reduced personal accountability. When systems failed, blame moved outward. Rarely did attention return inward toward the subtle distortions that preceded collapse. Thoth's wisdom resists this displacement. It insists that correction begins at the smallest scale, with attention, with language, with record, with choice. These elements may appear insignificant in isolation, but they accumulate. Over time, they shape systems more powerfully than grand designs ever could. This accumulation explains why wisdom often appears invisible until it is absent. When inner alignment is maintained, systems feel stable. Nothing demands attention. When it erodes, instability multiplies. Crisis becomes unavoidable. Thoth's ancient function was to prevent this erosion from going unnoticed for too long. As the narrative approaches its final movements, the boundary between God and human dissolves further. Thoth no longer stands apart as a divine overseer. He becomes a pattern of awareness that can be inhabited, a way of relating to time, to truth, to responsibility. In this sense, the God of wisdom was always transitional, a bridge between instinct and reflection, between impulse and care. And so, as the long arc of the story bends toward closure, the question that remains is no longer historical or mythological. It is practical. Can attention be sustained in a world that rewards distraction? Can accuracy be valued in cultures that prize certainty? Can memory be protected without nostalgia? These are not questions Thoth answers for humanity. They are questions he leaves behind, recorded carefully, waiting to be weighed again by each generation and by each individual willing to pause long enough to listen. Listening long enough is itself an act of resistance against forgetting. In a world that moves relentlessly forward, stillness becomes the rarest form of discipline. Ancient wisdom recognized this. Silence was not emptiness. It was a condition for clarity. Thoth's association with the moon reflects this truth. The moon does not blaze like the sun. It reflects. It measures time quietly, marking passage without demanding attention. This reflective quality becomes essential as cycles of collapse and renewal compress closer together. When change accelerates, the margin for correction narrows. Errors propagate faster. Consequences arrive sooner. Under these conditions, the ancient method of slow observation appears inadequate, even obsolete. Yet it is precisely this method that offers stability when speed overwhelms comprehension. The ancients did not believe wisdom could outpace reality. They believed it must move in step with it. When movement exceeded understanding, restraint was required. Thoth's wisdom functioned as a brake, not to halt progress, but to prevent disintegration. Without such braking mechanisms, systems tear themselves apart under their own momentum. Modern narratives often frame restraint as fear, but ancient thought understood it as respect. Respect for limits, respect for consequence, respect for the complexity of systems that cannot be controlled through force alone. Thoth embodied this respect. He did not promise mastery over nature. He offered alignment with it. Alignment, however, is an ongoing task. It cannot be achieved once and maintained indefinitely. Each generation must renegotiate it. Each context demands new calibration. This is why wisdom cannot be fully codified. Texts assist, symbols guide, but attention must be renewed continually. Thoth's ancient role was to remind humanity of this necessity through repetition rather than revelation. As collapse gives way to renewal, there is often a surge of optimism. New beginnings feel unburdened by old constraints. Possibility expands. This is a dangerous moment. Without memory, renewal repeats error. Thoth's presence at this threshold is subtle, but critical. He insists that beginnings require reference. That freedom without orientation becomes chaos. In mythic terms, this is where the scribe stands beside the creator, not to command, but to count, to ensure that creation does not exceed coherence. In human terms, this translates into planning grounded in record, innovation guided by history, aspiration tempered by measurement. As this phase of the story closes, the cycle is complete. Catastrophe has filtered, renewal has begun, memory has been preserved just enough to allow continuity. Thoth's work, once again, recedes from view, not because it is finished, but because it has succeeded. And with that success comes a final quiet truth. Wisdom does not announce itself at the height of civilization. It whispers at the edges, in moments of pause, in acts of care that go unnoticed. It survives not through celebration, but through practice. And as long as attention remains possible, the ancient scribe remains present, waiting patiently for the next moment when remembering becomes necessary again. That necessity to remember returns not as nostalgia, but as interpretation. Once the cycle of collapse and renewal stabilizes, attention shifts from survival to meaning. Humanity begins to ask not only how to rebuild, but what the fragments that survived were meant to convey. In this phase, wisdom is no longer purely practical. It becomes reflective. Thoth's role evolves again, guiding not reconstruction, but understanding. Interpretation is where distortion most easily enters. Fragments invite speculation. Symbols invite projection. What was once method becomes metaphor. What was once instruction becomes belief. This is not a failure of memory, but a natural consequence of distance. When original contexts are lost, meaning must be inferred. Thoth's ancient challenge resurfaces here with renewed urgency. How can interpretation remain aligned when reference points have faded? The ancients anticipated this risk. They encoded redundancy into their knowledge, patterns repeated across domains. Cosmic cycles mirrored human ones. Ratios appeared in architecture, music, and myth alike. This repetition was not decorative, it was corrective. If one interpretation drifted, others could pull it back toward coherence. Thoth's wisdom relied on cross-verification long before the concept had a name. As later thinkers encounter these patterns, some recognize their function intuitively. Others mistake correspondence for coincidence. The difference lies not in intelligence, but in orientation. Those seeking certainty tend to simplify. Those seeking alignment tolerate complexity. Thoth's influence favors the latter. He does not reward quick conclusions. He rewards sustained attention. This distinction becomes especially important as ancient symbols are re-examined through new intellectual frameworks. Astronomy becomes astrophysics. Alchemy becomes chemistry. Myth becomes psychology. Each translation strips away imagery while retaining structure. When done carefully, this process reveals continuity. When done hastily, it produces reduction. Thoth's wisdom resides in the careful translation, not the dismissal of earlier forms. Reduction feels efficient, but it often removes safeguards. Symbols that once carried ethical weight are flattened into data. Context is lost. Application accelerates. Without the ancient emphasis on restraint, knowledge becomes powerful faster than it becomes wise. This imbalance echoes earlier cycles, reminding us that interpretation without humility invites the same drift that once led to collapse. Thoth's presence in this interpretive phase is almost entirely invisible. He does not appear as a figure. He appears as hesitation, as a footnote, as a margin note questioning an assumption, as a reminder that understanding is provisional. This invisibility is his protection. It allows wisdom to persist, even when certainty dominates discourse. As the narrative continues into its final act, the focus will shift fully into theory, symbolic versus literal readings, cycles of time reimagined as cosmic mechanics. The temptation to locate Thoth not as function, but as origin. These theories reveal as much about the interpreter as they do about the past, and through them, the ancient scribe continues his work, not correcting conclusions directly, but shaping the way questions are asked. For wisdom does not demand agreement, it demands care, and care, once lost, must be relearned slowly, interpretation by interpretation, across the long, patient arc of time. As interpretation deepens, a familiar temptation arises, the desire to locate a single origin, a first teacher, a hidden master from whom all knowledge flows. In this search, Thoth is sometimes recast not as function, but as source, as if wisdom itself could be traced back to a singular being who gifted it fully formed to humanity. This idea is compelling, but it subtly misrepresents the ancient perspective. The earliest traditions did not treat wisdom as a possession that could be handed over intact. They treated it as a relationship that had to be maintained. Thoth was not revered because he knew everything, but because he remained attentive. His greatness lay in constancy, not omniscience. To transform him into an origin point is to misunderstand the nature of what he represented. This misunderstanding reflects a broader pattern in human thought. When faced with complexity, the mind seeks compression. Stories condense processes into figures. Systems become characters. Functions become personalities. This makes memory easier, but it also risks distortion. Thoth's transformation into a singular sage or extraterrestrial teacher in later theories reflects this compression at work. The function is remembered, but the process is simplified. Ancient wisdom resisted this simplification through multiplicity. Knowledge was distributed across domains. No single text contained everything. No single figure embodied all understanding. Even Thoth shared responsibility with other principles. Balance, truth, and order were collaborative forces. This distributed structure made wisdom resilient. It could not be lost with the fall of one institution or the death of one teacher. When later interpretations collapse this structure into a single narrative, they often strip away its safeguards. Mystery becomes spectacle. Patience becomes revelation. The slow work of calibration is replaced by dramatic explanation. These stories can inspire fascination, but they rarely cultivate wisdom. They encourage belief rather than practice. Thoth's ancient role offers a counterpoint. He does not reveal hidden truths suddenly. He preserves methods that allow truth to be approached gradually. This distinction is crucial. Wisdom that arrives without effort is rarely sustained. Wisdom that emerges through disciplined attention becomes integrated into perception itself. As speculative theories multiply, each claiming access to lost knowledge, the ancient lesson repeats quietly in the background. Precision matters more than excitement. Context matters more than conclusion. Without these anchors, interpretation drifts into projection. The past becomes a mirror for present desires rather than a guide shaped by experience. Thoth's presence during this phase of theory building is subtle but persistent. He appears wherever claims are tested rather than accepted, wherever sources are weighed rather than celebrated, wherever the limits of interpretation are acknowledged rather than ignored. This is not the work of belief. It is the work of care. As the narrative moves forward, it will examine these speculative impulses more closely, not to dismiss them, but to understand what they reveal about humanity's enduring hunger for meaning. And within that hunger, the ancient scribe's quiet warning remains. Wisdom is not hidden because it is forbidden. It is hidden because it must be approached with patience, or it dissolves into illusion. That illusion often takes the form of certainty dressed as discovery. When fragments of the ancient world are reassembled too quickly, the result can feel revelatory while remaining ungrounded. Patterns are detected but not tested. Connections are asserted but not weighed. In this atmosphere, interpretation becomes performance. Thoth's ancient ethic stands in quiet opposition to this impulse, reminding us that coherence is not proven by excitement, but by endurance. Endurance is a demanding standard. It requires ideas to survive contact with time, contradiction, and consequence. The ancients trusted this process. They allowed theories to age. They observed whether predictions held. They revised without embarrassment. This patience protected wisdom from becoming ideology. Thoth's role as recorder was central here. Recording made revision possible. Without record, error could be denied. With record, it could be addressed. Modern fascination with lost knowledge often bypasses this discipline. The allure lies in recovery rather than responsibility. To uncover is easier than to maintain. Yet ancient wisdom valued maintenance above revelation. A calendar was only as useful as its continued accuracy. A measurement mattered only if it could be corrected. Thoth's genius was recognizing that discovery without upkeep decays rapidly. This recognition reshapes how the past should be approached. Ancient texts are not puzzles to be solved once, but conversations to be entered repeatedly. Each reading reveals new layers, not because the text changes, but because the reader does. Thoth's wisdom assumes this dynamic. Meaning unfolds over time, not in moments of insight alone. As interpretations proliferate, some will inevitably drift far from their foundations. This is not entirely negative. Exploration generates contrast. It exposes assumptions. It tests boundaries. But without return, exploration becomes exile. Thoth's presence ensures that return remains possible. He anchors speculation to method, reminding inquiry where it began. This anchoring does not restrict imagination. It disciplines it. It asks whether a theory increases clarity or merely complexity, whether it enhances alignment or fuels distraction. These questions are not imposed externally. They arise naturally within a mind trained to value coherence over novelty. As the story advances toward its final reflections, the figure of Thoth becomes almost unnecessary. His work has been absorbed into the fabric of inquiry itself. Wherever patience tempers curiosity, wherever revision is welcomed, wherever precision is valued over persuasion, his influence is active. The ancient scribe no longer needs a name or a myth. He persists as a standard, a quiet measure against which ideas are weighed. And in that weighing, the long story of wisdom continues, not rushing toward conclusion, but moving carefully, deliberately, through the vast and unfinished landscape of human understanding. Moving carefully through that landscape requires accepting an uncomfortable truth. Wisdom does not guarantee comfort. It often removes it. Clear measurement exposes imbalance. Accurate record reveals patterns that cannot be ignored. This exposure can feel destabilizing, especially when long-held beliefs depend on obscurity for their stability. Thoth's ancient function was never to protect comfort. It was to protect coherence, even when coherence demanded change. Change in this context is rarely dramatic. It unfolds through accumulation. Small corrections alter trajectories gradually. Over time, these adjustments reshape entire systems. This subtlety makes wisdom easy to overlook. There is no single moment of transformation to celebrate, only a series of quiet decisions that prevent disaster by refusing to allow drift to continue unchecked. The ancients respected this quiet power deeply. They understood that the most consequential forces were often invisible. Gravity, time, memory. Thoth was aligned with these forces not because he controlled them, but because he attended to them. His wisdom lay in recognition rather than command. He saw what others ignored because it did not announce itself. As societies grow more complex, the ability to notice subtle signals diminishes. Noise increases. Attention fragments. Under such conditions, wisdom appears increasingly rare, not because it has vanished, but because it requires conditions that are difficult to sustain. Silence, patience, continuity. These conditions are fragile in cultures driven by immediacy. Yet even in such cultures, breakdown restores visibility. When systems falter, subtle signals become undeniable. What was once ignored demands attention. In these moments, the ancient method reasserts itself. Measurement returns. Records are consulted. Assumptions are questioned. Thoth's presence becomes palpable not as myth, but as necessity. This cycle suggests that wisdom is self-correcting. It cannot be permanently suppressed because reality enforces its principles regardless of belief. When misalignment grows severe, consequence intervenes. Correction follows. The role of the scribe is not to prevent consequence, but to translate it into understanding. Without this translation, collapse repeats without learning. As the narrative nears its final movements, this translation becomes the central concern. What does humanity choose to carry forward from each cycle of correction? Which lessons are preserved? Which are ignored? Thoth's ancient task was to curate this inheritance carefully, ensuring that what survived could guide future recalibration rather than merely memorialize loss. In this sense, wisdom is not cumulative. It is selective. It grows not by addition, but by refinement, by discarding what no longer aligns, by preserving what endures under pressure. This refinement is ongoing. It has no final form, and as long as it continues, the ancient scribe remains present, not as a figure from the past, but as an active principle shaping the slow, deliberate evolution of understanding across time. That slow evolution often unfolds beneath awareness. Most people do not experience wisdom as revelation, but as constraint, as boundaries that feel inconvenient, as limits that prevent certain actions from being taken. In ancient understanding, these limits were not obstacles. They were protections. Thoth's wisdom operated through constraint precisely because constraint preserves structure. Structure, when respected, allows complexity to grow without collapse. When ignored, complexity accelerates toward instability. This relationship was understood long before it was articulated in modern terms. Ancient societies embedded constraint into ritual, law, and custom. These frameworks were not arbitrary. They encoded lessons learned through failure. Thoth's role was to ensure these lessons remained legible. Over time, however, constraint is often reinterpreted as oppression. Boundaries are seen as outdated. Limits are challenged not through refinement, but through rejection. This impulse is understandable. It reflects a desire for freedom. But without discernment, freedom dissolves into volatility. Thoth's wisdom distinguishes between restrictive constraint and stabilizing constraint. The former limits possibility. The latter preserves it. This distinction is subtle and easily lost. It requires an ability to see beyond immediate benefit toward long-term consequence. Ancient record-keeping supported this vision. By preserving sequences over generations, patterns became visible. Actions could be evaluated not by intention alone, but by outcome across time. Thoth's presence ensured that this longitudinal perspective remained available. When records are fragmented or dismissed, perspective narrows. Decisions are made based on immediate context. Consequences are externalized. Responsibility diffuses. In such environments, wisdom appears impractical. Yet reality continues to operate on long arcs, regardless of attention. Eventually, deferred consequences converge. Correction becomes unavoidable. At that point, constraint returns abruptly, often imposed by circumstance rather than choice. Resources diminish, options narrow, freedom contracts. This is the harsh version of what gentle constraint once offered. Thoth's wisdom aimed to prevent this severity by introducing limits early, when adjustment was still possible. Understanding this reframes the ancient scribe's role once more. He is not the guardian of tradition for its own sake. He is the guardian of margin, of space to adjust, of time to respond. By maintaining alignment, he preserves flexibility. Without alignment, systems harden until they shatter. As the narrative approaches its final phase, this insight becomes central. Wisdom is not the accumulation of possibilities. It is the preservation of viability. It ensures that futures remain open by preventing the erosion of conditions that make choice meaningful. In this sense, Thoth's legacy is profoundly ethical, though not moralistic. It does not dictate what should be chosen. It ensures that choice remains possible. And in a world increasingly defined by irreversible decisions, this ancient commitment to reversibility may be the most valuable inheritance of all. Preserving reversibility is a quiet form of foresight. It acknowledges that no generation fully understands the consequences of its actions. By keeping options open, wisdom honors the limits of perspective. Thoth's ancient function was rooted in this humility. He did not assume final knowledge. He assumed the need for correction. This assumption shaped every aspect of his symbolic role, from record-keeping to mediation. Mediation, in particular, reveals the ethical depth of this wisdom. Thoth did not take sides in conflicts between gods or principles. He clarified terms. He restored proportion. He ensured that resolution did not create greater imbalance elsewhere. This approach contrasts sharply with later tendencies to resolve conflict through dominance. Victory feels decisive, but it often eliminates alternatives. Thoth's method preserved dialogue. it maintained the possibility of future adjustment. This emphasis on mediation extends beyond myth. In practical terms, it reflects an understanding that systems are interconnected. Changing one element affects others in unpredictable ways. Ancient wisdom approached intervention cautiously, favoring incremental adjustment over sweeping reform. Thoth's presence in this process ensured that change remained legible and reversible. Legibility is critical. When systems become too complex to be understood, they become impossible to correct. Errors hide within layers of abstraction. Responsibility diffuses. Correction arrives only through collapse. Thoth's ancient insistence on clear records, simple measures, and transparent processes was a defense against this opacity. He kept systems readable so they could be repaired. As modern systems grow increasingly opaque, this lesson becomes urgent. Complexity without legibility undermines agency. Individuals cannot respond to forces they cannot comprehend. Wisdom, in this context, is not about simplifying reality, but about preserving pathways of understanding within it. Thoth's legacy offers a blueprint for doing so without halting progress. This blueprint does not reject innovation. It disciplines it. It asks whether new structures can still be measured, audited, and revised. If not, they risk becoming irreversible. And irreversibility is the enemy of wisdom. Once a system cannot be adjusted, it dictates terms rather than serving life. As the narrative moves toward its final reflections, this principle stands out clearly. Thoth was not the god of answers. He was the god of conditions. He ensured that understanding could continue evolving, that mistakes could be corrected, that futures were not foreclosed prematurely. In a world facing accelerating change, this ancient commitment feels newly relevant. The question Thoth leaves behind is not what humanity should build next, but whether what it builds can still be understood, measured, and revised. If it can, wisdom remains active. If it cannot, the cycle of correction will return with force. And so, as the long arc of this story bends toward closure, the ancient scribe's final lesson emerges with quiet clarity. Wisdom is not about control, it is about care. Care for systems, care for memory, care for the fragile space in which correction remains possible. Care, when practiced consistently, transforms how time itself is experienced. The future no longer appears as a destination to be conquered, but as a condition to be prepared for. This shift is subtle, yet profound. It changes the orientation of action from expansion to stewardship. Thoth's ancient wisdom was rooted in this orientation. He did not guide humanity toward an endpoint. He guided it toward continuity. Continuity requires acceptance of incompleteness. No system is ever finished. No record is ever final. This acceptance stands in tension with the human desire for closure. Stories seek endings. Narratives demand resolution. Yet reality remains open-ended. Thoth's role was to keep knowledge aligned with this openness, preventing it from hardening into final answers that could no longer adapt. This openness does not imply indecision. It implies readiness. Readiness to revise. Readiness to listen. Readiness to acknowledge error without collapsing into doubt. The ancient scribe cultivated this readiness through repetition and review. Calendars were checked. Records were compared. Measures were recalibrated. These acts reinforced a culture in which change was expected and managed rather than feared. Fear enters when systems become brittle, when adjustment is resisted long enough that only rupture remains. In such moments, the absence of care becomes visible. Neglect reveals itself through fragility. Thoth's wisdom sought to prevent this outcome by normalizing maintenance. Care was not an emergency response. It was a daily practice. As civilizations moved away from this ethic, maintenance became invisible labor, undervalued, delegated, forgotten. Innovation gained prestige. Preservation lost status. This imbalance created conditions where systems grew powerful but unstable. When they failed, the failure felt sudden, though it had been prepared through long neglect. Thoth's ancient method would have noticed the warning signs early, not through prophecy, but through attention. Attention, in this sense, is not passive awareness. It is active responsibility. To notice misalignment is to accept obligation to respond. This obligation is what makes wisdom demanding. It cannot be outsourced indefinitely. Eventually, someone must measure, someone must record, someone must care enough to correct. As the narrative moves toward its final act, the emphasis shifts fully to this responsibility, not as burden, but as inheritance. Thoth's legacy is not a body of secret knowledge. It is a way of relating to reality that preserves flexibility, coherence, and humility across time. In this final stretch, the God of wisdom fades almost completely as a figure. What remains is his function, dispersed into countless acts of care. Wherever someone chooses accuracy over convenience, wherever revision is welcomed rather than resisted, wherever memory is preserved not to glorify the past, but to protect the future. In these moments, the ancient scribe is present, quietly ensuring that the long conversation between humanity and time does not come to an abrupt and unnecessary end. That long conversation with time has no final speaker. It passes from hand to hand, mind to mind, generation to generation, shaped by what each chooses to notice and preserve. Thoth's ancient presence was never meant to dominate this conversation. It was meant to keep it intelligible, to ensure that meaning did not dissolve into noise as voices multiplied and contexts shifted. Intelligibility is fragile. It depends on shared reference, on language that still points to reality rather than circling itself. When reference is lost, words become performative rather than descriptive. Claims replace measurements. Identity replaces alignment. In such moments, wisdom appears to retreat, not because it has failed, but because it cannot function without attention to what is actually occurring. The ancients understood this danger deeply. They feared not ignorance, but distortion. A blank record could be rebuilt. A corrupted one misled reconstruction. This is why Thoth's role as recorder was so precise. He did not embellish. He did not soften. He recorded sequence as it unfolded, trusting that clarity, however uncomfortable, was more useful than reassurance. This ethic challenges modern instincts. There is a strong impulse to shape narratives for cohesion, to smooth over contradictions, to preserve morale. While understandable, these impulses can obscure early signs of misalignment. Thoth's wisdom insists that discomfort is often the first signal that correction is needed. To ignore it is to trade short-term calm for long-term instability. As humanity stands at increasingly complex thresholds, the relevance of this ancient ethic intensifies. Systems now operate at scales where small errors cascade rapidly. Feedback loops tighten. Consequences accelerate. Under such conditions, delayed correction becomes exponentially costly. Thoth's insistence on early attention appears not cautious, but urgent. Urgency, however, does not mean haste. It means priority. The priority of clarity over persuasion, of accuracy over affirmation, of revision over defense. These priorities run counter to many modern reward structures, which favor confidence, speed, and narrative control. Wisdom, as Thoth embodied it, often feels out of step with such environments. Yet being out of step is precisely how rhythm is restored. A counterbeat reveals tempo, a pause reveals motion. Thoth's ancient presence functions as this counterbeat, slowing perception just enough to reveal where alignment has been lost. Without it, acceleration becomes blind. As the narrative approaches its final reflections, the God of wisdom stands revealed not as a relic of ancient religion, but as a continuous invitation, an invitation to measure before declaring, to record before judging, to adjust before enforcing. These acts may seem small, but they shape whether systems endure or fracture. And so the story prepares to release its hold, not with conclusion, but with continuity. Thoth does not disappear at the end of his story. He dissolves into practice, into attention, into the quiet discipline of those who still believe that understanding is not something achieved once, but something maintained patiently across the long and unfinished arc of time. Maintained patiently, understanding begins to feel less like possession and more like posture, a way of standing within reality rather than mastering it. This posture is subtle. It does not announce authority. It does not seek recognition. It reveals itself through consistency, through the quiet refusal to distort what is seen for the sake of comfort or advantage. Thoth's ancient wisdom was always oriented toward this stance. At this stage of the story, the god of wisdom no longer needs myth to justify his relevance. His value is experiential. Those who adopt his posture notice changes that are difficult to describe but impossible to ignore. Systems feel less chaotic. Decisions feel less reactive. Consequences, though still present, arrive with greater legibility. Life becomes more navigable, not because it is simpler, but because it is better measured. This is where wisdom reveals its most misunderstood quality. It does not eliminate uncertainty. It makes uncertainty livable. By keeping records honest and boundaries clear, it prevents uncertainty from turning into fear. Thoth's ancient role was to keep uncertainty within tolerable limits, to ensure that the unknown did not overwhelm the known. This balance allowed cultures to explore without dissolving. Modern thought often treats uncertainty as failure, something to be eradicated through prediction and control. When this eradication fails, anxiety grows. Thoth's wisdom offers a different relationship. Uncertainty is acknowledged as permanent. The task is not to remove it, but to orient within it. Measurement becomes a way of finding footing rather than certainty. This orientation reshapes responsibility. Action is taken with awareness of incomplete knowledge. Decisions are framed as provisional. Revision is anticipated rather than resisted. This does not weaken commitment. It strengthens resilience. Systems designed with revision in mind survive shock better than those built on assumed permanence. In ancient terms, this was the difference between hubris and harmony. To overestimate certainty was to invite correction. To respect limits was to avoid catastrophe. Thoth's presence ensured that this lesson remained accessible, not as threat, but as guidance. As the narrative enters its final movements, this guidance turns inward once more. The listener is no longer being told about ancient gods or forgotten civilizations. They are being invited into a way of seeing, one that recognizes wisdom not in grand conclusions, but in sustained care. The god of wisdom fades almost completely now, not because he is gone, but because he has done his work. He has taught attention how to hold steady, memory how to endure without clinging, knowledge how to remain flexible without dissolving. What remains is not belief, but practice. And in that practice, the ancient continuity persists, quietly, patiently, without demand, waiting only for the next moment when someone chooses to pause, measure, and care enough to keep the long conversation with time alive a little longer. Keeping that conversation alive requires a willingness to release the need for final answers. Ancient wisdom did not promise completion. It promised continuity. This distinction matters deeply at the end of long cycles, when exhaustion tempts the mind to seek closure rather than care. Thoth's legacy offers something quieter and more sustainable, not resolution, but orientation. Orientation is the ability to locate oneself honestly within change. It does not depend on certainty. It depends on reference. When reference is maintained, movement becomes possible without panic. When reference is lost, even stillness feels unstable. The ancient scribe's task was always to preserve reference points, to ensure that time, truth, and consequence remained connected enough to guide action. In the modern imagination, gods are often judged by what they grant: power, protection, salvation. Thoth offers none of these directly. What he offers is coherence. the ability to see clearly enough to respond wisely. This gift is subtle and easily overlooked, yet it shapes outcomes more reliably than intervention ever could. As civilizations age, they tend to mythologize their beginnings and romanticize their endings. The present becomes distorted by longing or fear. Wisdom resists both impulses. It remains anchored in what is observable now. Thoth's ancient posture was always present-focused. He recorded what happened, not what should have happened. This discipline preserved truth even when it was inconvenient. That inconvenience is essential. Truth that flatters rarely corrects. Truth that clarifies often unsettles. Thoth's presence is felt most strongly when attention is redirected toward uncomfortable alignment, when language is sharpened, when assumptions are tested, when records are compared rather than celebrated. These acts are rarely dramatic, but they are decisive. As the story approaches its final moments, the emphasis shifts away from history and toward inheritance. What does it mean to inherit wisdom without ceremony, without temples, without gods who speak in thunder? It means accepting responsibility for continuity without expecting recognition. It means caring for alignment even when no one is watching. This inheritance is fragile. It cannot be enforced. It can only be chosen. Each generation decides whether to maintain reference or allow drift. Each individual decides whether to measure honestly or accept convenience. Thoth's legacy survives only through these choices. In this sense, the God of wisdom was always provisional. His presence depended on attention. When attention waned, he receded. When it returned, he reappeared, not as a figure descending from myth, but as a clarity emerging from practice. And so, as the long narrative prepares to close, there is no final revelation waiting, only a recognition that wisdom has never been distant. It has always been near, quiet, and demanding in the same way, asking not for belief, but for care, not for certainty, but for honesty. And in that honesty, the ancient scribe continues his work, as long as time itself continues to unfold. As time continues to unfold, the presence of wisdom becomes less a matter of belief and more a matter of rhythm. Those who align with it often describe the same sensation, regardless of culture or era, a feeling of steadiness amid uncertainty, a sense that even when outcomes are unclear, orientation remains intact. This steadiness is not emotional comfort. It is structural confidence, born from knowing that correction is still possible. The ancients understood that this confidence could not be taught directly. It had to be cultivated through repetition, through return, through the slow accumulation of small, accurate acts. Thoth's role was to sustain the conditions under which this cultivation could occur. He did not accelerate growth, he protected its pace. In doing so, he ensured that understanding matured alongside responsibility. In later ages, this pace is often seen as inefficiency. Slowness is mistaken for weakness, yet history reveals the opposite. Systems that endure are rarely those that move fastest. They are those that notice when to slow down. Thoth's wisdom offered this discernment, not as rule, but as sensitivity, a felt awareness of when momentum exceeds coherence. This sensitivity is difficult to maintain in isolation. It requires reinforcement. Ancient cultures provided this through shared ritual and collective memory. Modern life often lacks such reinforcement. As a result, individuals must carry this responsibility more consciously. Wisdom becomes a solitary practice rather than a communal one. This solitude can feel burdensome, but it also offers clarity. Clarity emerges when external validation fades, when decisions are guided not by consensus, but by alignment. Thoth's ancient presence supports this clarity by offering a standard that does not depend on opinion. Measurement does not negotiate. Record does not flatter. Consequence does not argue. These realities provide orientation even when narratives conflict. As the story nears its final block, the arc completes itself quietly. The God of wisdom does not stand revealed in triumph. He dissolves into the fabric of attention itself, into the act of noticing, of pausing, of choosing care over speed. These acts may seem small, but they accumulate. Over time, they shape destinies more surely than ambition ever could. In this near silence, the long documentary of hidden time finds its calm. There is no final lesson to declare, only a gentle recognition that wisdom has always been less about what is known and more about how carefully knowledge is held. And as long as there are those willing to hold it with patience, the ancient work continues, uninterrupted, beyond the reach of forgetting. Beyond the reach of forgetting, wisdom does not wait in monuments or texts alone. It waits in attention, in the quiet decision to measure before acting, to record before judging, to revise before insisting. These choices do not feel heroic, yet they shape the arc of time more reliably than force or certainty ever could. Thoth's ancient presence was always aligned with this truth. At the end of the long story, there is no final image of the god standing apart from humanity. There is only continuity. The same moon still marks cycles. The same need for alignment still returns. The same consequences still follow mismeasurement. What has changed is not the structure of reality, but the opportunity to respond to it with care. Ancient cultures gave this care a face and a name, so it could be remembered emotionally as well as intellectually. They called it Thoth, not because they believed wisdom needed a ruler, but because memory needs form. Over time, the form faded. The function remained. It moved into methods, disciplines, habits of thought. It became invisible precisely because it succeeded. This invisibility is the final paradox of wisdom. When it works, nothing dramatic happens. Systems remain viable. Choices remain flexible. Futures remain open. When it fails, collapse draws attention back to what was neglected. Thoth's role was never to prevent this cycle, but to soften it, to ensure that even in forgetting, something essential endured. And so, the story closes without closure. Because wisdom does not conclude, it continues. It is taken up by each generation in small, often unnoticed ways, in classrooms and workshops, in careful planning and honest revision, in the courage to admit error early rather than deny it until consequence forces recognition. The God of wisdom does not ask to be worshipped at the end of his story. He asks to be practiced, quietly, patiently, without expectation of reward. As long as there are those willing to do this, the ancient continuity remains unbroken. Time moves on. Civilizations rise and fall. Names change, symbols fade, yet the work endures. And in that endurance, the story of Thoth finds its truest expression, not as myth preserved in stone, but as care preserved in action. A living inheritance, carried forward wherever attention is willing to meet reality honestly and hold it, gently, without fear.